I'm Ed Sperling. I'm the editor-in-chief of Semiconductor Engineering. I'm at Promex with Dave Fromm. I'm going to talk today about what's changing in medical devices. If you think about medical devices today, they're a lot more complicated than they were in the past. There's a lot more connectivity into the cloud. There's a lot more chips that are being packaged together and a lot more components on a chip itself and inside a package. What sort of challenges are you facing?
Devices today are a lot higher integration than they were in even 5, 10 years ago. And this is because the devices that are being produced today are being asked to do a lot more and to do this in a way that can be field deployable, higher portability, much smaller, much more reliable, much more durable.
So some of the problems that you've been dealing with in the past have been coplanarity, but it's gotten a lot more complicated than just that, right?
Right. Yeah, the devices, not only do devices have to be built with high levels of coplanarity so that they work, the parts that go into these devices for these varied medical devices themselves have a lot of special requirements specific to the devices themselves. They have onboard chemistries, for example, and these devices with sensors that have chemistries on them. The devices can't be processed at temperatures high enough to destroy the chemistry. If that temperature is 40 to 50 degrees C, that obviously creates a lot of challenges for the assembly.
Let's take a closer look.
Sure.
Dave, what are we looking at?
So what we're looking at here is I wanted to contrast the traditional model of a medical device, which was a local device, standalone device that made its measurement or imparted whatever it needed to do onto a patient as a network that's really simple. You have a doctor, you have a patient, and between them you have the medical device. This paradigm is what governed medical devices for 100 years, but that's changed in the past 5 to 10 years to a new model where it's a distributed network where you have portable instruments that are field deployable. This is a device, this is a patient, and the doctor no longer has to be co located with the patient and the device itself. These devices are characterized being smaller, lower power consumption, oftentimes battery powered, and they're easier to use. I may not need a doctor to actually use the device as we did in the old days. It might even be run by the patient themselves. There could be an external user to help them, but in this case, I just have the patient running the device. In this case, the data from the device gets pushed to the cloud via the internet, and then it can be distributed to either that person's physician directly in a remote setting, or it can be routed to the electronic medical record system of all your medical data and then be interpreted by a broader doctor network. And so, what this allows you to do is no longer have just one doctor who's right where you're getting your care. You now can have lots of doctors taking the data from this instrument to make evaluations on your health.
And so now you have some fairly complex electronics in here, right? You have connectivity, which means that your communication has to be secured, it has to be robust, you have to make sure you're getting the right information out there from the sensors. And you also have much more accurate sensors than you had in the past, too, right?
Correct. Not only are we asking the devices to be portable and field deployable and have this additional functionality, but the core functionalities of these devices are better than they were in the past. The sensors for a sensing device or actuators for an actuating device are higher fidelity. They're much better than they were in previous generations of device. And so we're asking them to do more with less, which means these devices have to inherently become smaller and more integrated because they need to be purposely designed and built to do specifically their function. Whereas in the old days, you could get away with integrating off the shelf components and configure them for your particular application.
This purpose built, though, is basically one off type of devices, right? So now you really are customizing the whatever you're designing here and putting together into a package. What sort of problems does that create?
Creates a lot of problems. The devices themselves have very specific requirements oftentimes that are specific to that particular device. And so the materials that go into that device, the processes that join these materials and parts have to be different. They have to be very customized for every device that you're trying to assemble.
How does that work in terms of packaging, though? Because now, as you mentioned before, you've got very different temperature restraints on whatever materials you're using.
Yeah, let's take an example where we have an instrument that measures something about your health, right? It could be a disease or what have you. Oftentimes, these devices themselves will interact with a consumable, and that consumable may contain electronics. Those consumables oftentimes have chemistry on the consumables themselves, modifying the surfaces of some of the semiconductors inside the devices. These chemistries are fragile. They break down and they stop working if you heat them up. So typically, it's not uncommon for these devices to have to be processed using traditional semiconductor processing things like wire bonding and die attach, but at temperatures 40 degrees or lower. So, in other words, how do you do all these processes which were not designed to operate at room temperature, but do them at room temperature?
And you've also got some constraints in terms of the standard materials that you have to use, right? Because there are rules about what you can put into the body or use for medical purposes.
Correct. So, there's an incredible limitation on the materials that go into these devices. So for something that contacts the skin or the patient in some other way directly, oftentimes there's a biocompatibility requirement which restricts the number of materials that you can use so they don't cause some adverse reaction with the patient. Similarly, for the materials themselves, the supply chains for these materials need to be controlled so that changes are understood and can be tested by the manufacturers before they get released. So, die attach adhesive, that full supply chain for that adhesive must be controlled to be used in a medical device.
You've also got a lot of this stuff being used in fairly small quantities for these devices. So now you have to ensure that the supply chain itself is going to have that kind of purity that you don't normally associate with these limited quantities, right?
Correct. Not only that, you have to also ensure supply chain continuity, that these materials belong and around for the long product life cycle of these products, which is oftentimes 10 years or more. So now we're asking manufacturers for materials that are used in small quantities. And we ask those materials to be supported for a very long time with extra control. So this is obviously a complex battle to work through with these materials.
For a long time, there was a big distinction between devices that were going into the body and devices that were external. It sounds to me like what you've got going on here is you've got external constraints that you didn't have in the past.
Yeah, that's oftentimes the case because of the assembly technologies that you're using to build these devices themselves. So, implantable devices were always small and they always looked like microelectronics devices, I'd say, in some form or another. But now, external devices, instruments, wearables, they're small as well. And now they also look like microelectronics devices because of their size.
Can you take one of these devices and potentially add another device? And is there any way that these are standardized so that they can communicate and actually deliver compound results, perhaps?
This infrastructure is starting to come about now because this idea was so new a few years ago. There's now that infrastructure of hardware that can be common to these devices that have wireless or Bluetooth connectivity, for example, that can talk to several devices and have the security to ensure that this patient data, which is obviously highly sensitive, is protected in the right way. So the software and firmware that underlies those goes with these special modules and can be adapted into these products.
Is that happening on a global basis too, as opposed to just maybe US or Europe?
Yeah, I think they're starting to combine the requirements across the world. They all have specific requirements, especially in terms of data privacy and security. But they're starting to harmonize as time goes on.
AI plays a role in here as well, right? So now are you actually putting AI into these devices or is it all external and you're doing the analysis of the patterns that you're seeing?
Good question. With this model, usually what you'll see is the data in the cloud can be analyzed and compared against basis sets compiled from anonymized sources of patients so that they're not attributed to one particular individual. An example of this would be, advanced pathology, where this device measures some image of some cells, and they can look at that device and compare it to similar images, and do the pathology with higher accuracy as time goes on, as these models improve over just a pathologist reading and say, hey, you have cancer, or no, you don't have cancer.
Or potentially you have an outbreak, and here's one case of this, and it's showing up at another case in a different location. You could start putting this together on a global basis.
Correct. So that's happening for diagnostics devices. You have networks of these instruments measuring people and looking if they have some disease all over. And those geolocations are noted. And so you can see that, okay, there's a flu outbreak that's going across this part of the country, this part of the world. And these are the types of flu, the strains of flu that are spreading. That is absolutely occurring right now.
You've basically got a communication stack, right? Because what you're saying is you collect data locally. That goes basically to the edge, which may be your phone and maybe a server on the edge, and then it can potentially go to the cloud as well. And so you've got to now manage this communication all the way across. You need the capability of saying, "Hey, how do we get this information back and forth?"
Yeah, that's the challenge for these products is, where does the data live? How does the data get between the different places it needs to go, and where can that be secure? So typically phone is not considered to be secure, but you can make the device itself secure. Then the phone is basically an internet router. The cloud can then be specialized and secure. And of course, the electronic medical records, those are highly secure as well.
What comes next? I mean, where do you see this evolving to?
I see this becoming the norm. And what you're going to start to see 10 years from now, 20 years from now, is these devices are going to get so good that the doctors themselves can also get, distributed in some fashion. So at some level, the results from the instruments will be so accurate that the doctors will certify that their results are fine. And so they don't actually have to interpret each result. So these devices automatically generate a diagnosis and the treatment based on that diagnosis, all remotely without human intervention.
So basically, it's restructuring the doctors themselves because now you're saying they don't have to be in one place. You don't have to go to a specialty clinic. All this information is now being absorbed by the best experts, and it can get escalated up. It can be lowered down, whichever way it happens to go.
That's correct. And that's the real beauty of this is the accessibility and democratization of high levels of care will be made possible by these instruments. It used to only be if I didn't have the best doctor with the best equipment in the room with me, I wouldn't necessarily be able to get the best standard of care. If everybody has access to these devices, and we can do some sort of remote diagnosis with these high quality results, people can then get the care that they deserve.
So let's drop this down a few nanometer levels here and go, okay, what happens now in terms of aging of equipment, in terms of reliability of the equipment? How do you build that into your devices?
That's also a great question. The devices themselves, because they're smarter and they have more data being acquired within the devices than they did in the old paradigm that we talked about, there's onboard diagnostics that can be found for these devices. So you can know whether these devices need to be serviced, whether they need to be calibrated, whether they're damaged, whether they're not functioning properly. That data you can create, internal self checks, and that diagnostic data can then go to another person who can live in here, the manufacturer, and they can look at, is my instrument working correctly? Is it working the way I want it to? So that's another aspect of this design here where you can now add the manufacturer of the device, and they can look at the health of the instrument. So this is another opportunity that's starting to come on, and that improves the economics of these devices because no longer do I have to employ an army of field service people to go look at these things to see if they're okay. I only have to deploy them when there is a problem.
Do you have to build redundancy into these devices as well?
Yeah, you do. You have to build smarts and intelligence in these devices because I might not have a skilled user actually using the device. It might be the patient themselves. So the device has to be A, easy enough to use that anybody can use it, and B, have some sort of self control in it to say, am I being used properly? And so there's ways to design in checks with the result to say, yes, this result was acquired in a proper operational method, then the result is valid. Go ahead and make a diagnostic decision.
You're moving a lot more data than you were in the past, too. Is there enough bandwidth in these devices, or do you need to now start going to something like co-packaged optics?
Currently, there's enough bandwidth to push these results back and forth with, traditional wireless type of communications, or even gather the evidence and then wait till you get to a wired or wireless connection and then move the data around. We're not quite there yet, but I can imagine that in certain cases, especially when dealing with videos or movies, like in pathology, I can imagine that being the case.
So what does it take to build one of these?
Well, that's the fun of it, is the way that you build these things is very different than you used to. So in the old days, building devices that were large and standalone and integrations of other large and standalone devices, it really looked like the assembly line was people turning screwdrivers and putting together boards and putting those devices in a metal housing and then screwing that shut and then shipping it off. But now what you're seeing is, instead of these devices being made by people turning screwdrivers, they're being made by people building microchips, putting them on boards, and building highly integrated, very small devices.
Are chiplets coming in here as well?
Not yet. Chiplets are still probably in the future, but the ideas of what it takes to build a chiplet are ideas that do come into building these devices. Where now you're combining this heterogeneous integration of combining electronics parts with non-electronics parts into one device, into one package.
For years, we've been hearing about labs on a chip. That's part of what's going on here, right? We're talking microfluidics combined with advanced types of electronics that we've never seen go together very well. Is that going to change in the future?
Becoming more ubiquitous for these diagnostics devices. There's a lot of devices now where they're looking for, fluid samples, saliva, blood, urine, doing some diagnostic locally on a consumable device, which oftentimes does have what you're describing. There's another class of devices which are coming about where there's actually sensor chips. They're that measure volatile organic compounds in people's breath, for example. Those are potentially an interesting new path for diagnostics over the next 10 years.
And these devices can be very specific, but they also can be always on too, right? And that's one of the great advantages here is that you have continuous monitoring of a lot of these things. That affects how you design this, though, because now you're dealing with heat just from running this device.
Yeah, heat, power consumption, maintaining that data continuity and that data integrity. These are all aspects of the device that have to be considered at the lowest level of the design.
There's another marriage that's going on here, which is that the electronics industry has always moved very fast, and the medical community has been very, very slow historically. How do these two worlds come together?
Good question. I think the medical device world is starting to move faster as well. What's happening is they are borrowing expertise on how to move quickly and develop products in a controlled fashion, but bringing in this new technology, which raises other issues itself.
Yeah, I mean, really, what you're talking about here is breaking down silos between two completely different industries, right? They've never gone together before at this level.
Yeah, and that's oftentimes the hardest part of designing these kinds of products. The people who design these medical devices are world experts in what they do, but they don't know what they don't know. And so, how do you get them to ask the right questions, to understand the right risks and challenges of building and design a device that's so highly integrated? These things that we might take for granted in the semiconductor and the electronics industries are not necessarily so for the medical device. Just like the controls that go into a medical device and what it takes to manage a change and make changes and understand that those changes are appropriate, that's not well understood by electronics community. So you need to facilitate that by having folks who've kind of been on both sides of the fence.
For years, one of the big changes in the electronics side was the hardware engineers were sitting down with the software guys and trading cards when they got into meetings. Now you're basically doing completely different languages. Are they starting to get the idea that you need to communicate a lot better than they did in the past?
The good ones, yes. And this is how you form the right team, is really bringing together a system level view of it, where you have the mechanical engineers and the electrical engineers and the firmware engineers and all the other software engineering, along with the manufacturing engineers and quality folks, all working together side by side, because there aren't any problems that are just a mechanical problem or just an electrical problem. They span all of these. I can break something mechanically or then fix it and then end up breaking three other things electrically. That's what happens in these kind of devices.
Dave Fromm, thanks for a great explanation.
You're welcome. My pleasure.